So namaste everybody, welcome back to the bakery. Today we have a very good friend of mine, Swayam, who's the author of The God Killer. It's a wonderful book and we're going to talk about the book and some of his ideas today. Welcome Swayam, thanks a lot for joining us.
Namaste ji, namaste.
Namaskar. So if you could just begin with giving us a basic structure of the book, the ideas that went into writing the book and so on.
Well, asking a writer that number one. So be prepared for like hours and hours of, and then this inspiration and then that inspiration. But keeping that aside, I think the book basically, I started getting interested in, as you know, we used to have such intense discussions about politics, about history, and about economics and all of that. And slowly, that interest built up. And I guess I wanted to write a book which could reflect that reality, not in that drab way it comes across, like it should still be a fun read. So then I thought about condensing. If let us assume if all civilizations have a start point and an end point, so how they begin, how they coalesce, how they become what they are. So if we can form a file for it which will fit every civilization so far. So using that as a template, I move forward. I try to understand the role of economics. I try to understand the role of an individual in society, role of the society for the individual, sexism, racism, chauvinism, all of that jazz. And then we understand that all of these, even the bad components that I've just mentioned to you, they all are actually just tools and implements we use to build a civilization. Like, as much as we hate the idea, Keshav, you and I, of let us say chauvinism, nonetheless, the idea was there for a while. As much as let us say someone will hate the idea of feminism, even feminism existed. All of them had their particular role to play. If I may quote an example, so when we started off as a society of hunter-gatherers, the first time we had religions built, the religions were built with a very matrilineal point of view. Because that time the idea of giving birth was so magical. Now we can easily link it to the act of it and the semen and the egg and everything. Back then it was just wow. It was we doing something. And the individual doing it was the mother. So there were the earth goddess religions that started off. Old mother goddess, that Venus of clay, remember that Venus of Paris or something, right? First clay figure in the mom. Then slowly, what happened is we got into farming. Now, before this, we were hunter-gatherers, so we could divide the roles, and the mom was the one who's leading the entire clan together, keeping everything together with the women. Now, once we had farming done, then we needed plots of land. We needed someone to protect the plots of land and the cattle or whatever we had. Now, unfortunately or fortunately, we found out that males are stronger than females in the human species. So this role became more male dominated. Then over time, they got more impetus. And then the chauvinistic religions took over. Father became important, the brother became important, the husband became important. And then slowly, we progressed today to society where it really doesn't matter. Where all that matters is your, would you say, your input to society and what you are about. We can't discount all of this that went into it. And no matter how fair we make, let us say equality is guaranteed by law. Nonetheless, morally and ethically, we may choose what equality is. Before the law, equality means something. But in all our hearts, we may have a little bit of no, I am better, and if I am a man, then I believe a man is a little bit better. And likewise, if I'm a woman, maybe I'm a little better or worse, etc. Point is that all of them have their own parameters that work. And all of it together, legally also speaking, everything makes a society. So I wanted to understand this mechanism by which I didn't like anything being bad. Like all of it is good. Even the wars we've gone through, even World War II, even Hitler, even Genghis Khan, all of them, we keep looking at them as bad or good. It's not that. They were necessary. Without Hitler, without the entirety of World War II, we would not have understood why fascism fails. Like we would still be flirting with the idea. And can you imagine if we were flirting with the idea today? With the amount of like nuclear warheads we have and the amount of destructive power we have. So no, it was us growing up. It was like all humans, if you were 1%, teenage years trying to be cool, slapped around a bit, learn, okay, this is not cool. So now we find a very a perspective where we don't judge. And we apply that perspective to the progress of a society. And that was the basic idea for the God Killer. And yeah, have I gone on and on and on and on?
Right, so that's very interesting that you mentioned that because I mean, look at morality as a subject, right? The subjectivity of morality. Because at the end of the day, and I say this in the context of the world going nuts right now. I'm sure you've seen this whole J.K. Rowling thing that's been happening, and
Yeah.
Chomsky, the Ayatollah of the bloody liberal left, is now being cancelled by the same people whom he birthed. So So in the context of the world going nuts, and the subjectivity of, because all these concepts, right, equality, human rights, whatever it is, it's just a consensus we have come to. It's arbitrary. This shit doesn't exist in nature, you know. So how do you
Yeah.
view that? How do you view that whole concept?
So if we view it, see, what we do is now we use it, we don't understand it to be a tool. We try to think it's everything. We are everything. It's a tool we are using. So at one particular moment in history, let us say, it is necessary for us to be left because of the circumstances surrounding us. Let's assume tomorrow there is actually a holocaust that happens because of whatever reason, nuclear holocaust, right? And that entire matrix scenario takes over, no skies, nothing, limited resources. In limited resources, the individualism of capitalism cannot progress. It will cause us to die. We must at that moment become socially more aware, right? Think left, think right. We have to get communal. We have to get communal with the resources we have. At that moment, it is perfect. Imagine society where all of us have a degree of equality, where the amount of food we have is not actually questioned, where we have a lot of freedom. In this context, to have a communal structure is as incorrect as it is to have a capitalistic structure when we have less resources. So these are tools. Morality, the book also, and personally, it's a tool. We must use it according to the situation we see fit. It is the way we can like download the right mechanism of like, file transfers we have. So we have like this protocol or that protocol to transfer like data, right? So these are the same protocols we have amongst each other. Like today, we have less resources, then you and I, Keshav, must share the bread. We have to. Otherwise, you'll die. And if you die, I will die. Because we have to survive for each other, whether we like each other or not. The same way, tomorrow there are 10 loaves of bread. Then it's just as stupid for us to share that loaf of bread. Now, everyone can also question, why are you stopping there? Why is it wrong? And it's wrong because it doesn't let us flower in our own ways. You have your path to follow and I have mine. But death is the one equalizer where we take it. The closer we are getting to like an elimination, the more we have to help each other. But tomorrow, when that threat is reduced, we can actually give flowering to our mind, to all that we have thought of. And that requires you to go your way and me to go mine. Individually, nonetheless, with the shake hand and the yes, it's all cool. So morality for me comes from necessity. And that necessity so real because we need to make it real. We call it a morality. That's God. It's our belief. It's my love. It's whatever. But it's that necessity that drives it. So if we keep the necessity in perspective, we will be able to, the left will be okay with the right will be okay with the left, and the center will be the center. Just points of view for all of us to move forward. No hatred, no attachment of so much. But as a rider, we may say this, Keshav, but at the end of the day, once our own beliefs come on the line, you know how difficult it is to perspectivize it? And that also is I have yet to understand that completely. But for me, that's a source of wonderment. Like we can laugh like this, but tomorrow you say something which is close to my, hey, like why? And if you understand that, perhaps like the war's end, huh?
Yeah, man, the fragility of the individual now and the collective, really. Mass hysteria is such a big thing now, more than we realize it. It's just not spilling out into the streets. It is in some quarters. But yeah, coming to that, man, the name of the book. So a lot of people have who have seen the book or read it have asked me. Actually, not the people who have read it, but the people who have seen the book have asked me about the name. What's with the name? Is it just a catchy name to rile people up, or does it have a deeper meaning behind it?
Well, Keshav, I think so. Okay, so let's level with you. You know who can, Mukteshwar, the Hindu name for Shiv, one of the names is Mukteshwar.
Yeah.
That is who gives you Mukti. Mukti we can take to be in the context of English to be not really heaven. I don't know what it is. It's Mukti. It's
Right.
a release, like the ultimate release. Now, the only one who can give God that release will be a God himself, herself. But that will become the God killer. If we perspectivize all morality and all ethics to be a necessity, then that necessity becomes a God. Once that necessity changes, the way we look at that God must change. God is not changing. That is the God killer. That way. And
Right.
of course, all of this aside, also, the title was catchy. It gets people to think. But what I did not count on is that it makes people think that this is a book about atheism or it's one of those key far left or far right books. And it's neither of them. As much as I'd love to say that because you get a lot of traction. Yes, it's totally left. Yes, it's totally right. Do read it.
No, but people definitely should read it, man. It's a fascinating book, and I've been reading it since the nascent stages of the book. So
Full
uh,
power. And your dad too.
Yeah, man.
First
So
comment I got. First
yeah.
comment I
So,
got on Amazon. Your dad.
oh, really? I didn't know that, man.
Yeah, he wrote it's a good book. I still remember it, and I'm so happy it's not to do with Indian gods and all of that for a change, like an Indian author not writing about that. And then he wrote a line which I've been using whenever I have to explain the book to anyone. He said it's a very dark book and it's about deals with a lot of practical dark things, but it's without rancor. I love that line so much because somehow, when you write a book, you even sometimes you write it, but you subconsciously don't like you know why you're writing it, but it's not there at that, like in your mind. That one line of your dad, it was like, yeah, that's what I'm going for. I want to write it like but no rancor. Yeah, it happens. That. And yeah, so I use that a lot. Thank you,
Yeah,
uncle.
the matter of fact nature of it really comes through because that's something I think a lot of people, like everybody, needs to consider. Um, how to one separate ourselves emotionally from ideas and from happenings and so on, which is what you mentioned as well. So that's a very interesting thing that comes across. तो आज के सिचुएशन के हिसाब से कुछ यहाँ पे पैराग्राफ्स है which I'd like to read. They're very interesting, so that our
Okay.
listeners can also get a taste of it, and then maybe you can pontificate upon how this comes across in today's scenario. So this is from chapter 5. I'll just read it. But when the High King had issued his pacification edict, Altai was the first warlord to cease hostilities and welcome the peacemakers. The term of ceasefire included gold for the Wolf clan, stirrups for their horses, and Jamukwa was to be given over to civilization as a hostage to ensure the Wolf clan's good behavior. The stirrups gave their cavalry an excellent advantage. The accuracy of their mounted archers was increased threefold by this simple gift. The Wolf clan became dominant due to that innovation. But curiously enough, the other clans adopted the stirrups, learning from the example of their defeats at the hands of the wolf. Altai had absorbed enough clans by way of subjugation. He was an excellent commander who utilized all gifts bestowed to him by civilization to the fullest. But Altai was concerned by the influence of civilization, something he had initiated. He saw other clans receive similar gifts from civilization, and with reluctance, realized he too had to adopt the innovations or else lose power. Altai eventually started hating civilization, understanding belatedly how insidiously it worked. It also taught him that if the clans could somehow unite, they could crush civilization, which had everything in abundance except manpower. This fact was not lost to civilization, and through their agents, they actively sabotaged the relations between the clans. The peacemakers did their part by bartering clan enmities with innovation. Uh, I see a lot of today's geopolitics in this. A lot of the way we look at labor markets, at now, since we're in the age of automation, I see all of that in this, man. What do you interpret?
Well, now that you said that, I'll piggyback on what you said and say, yeah, that's exactly what I thought. But yes, you're very right about what you said. The way that I think, if I have to link this passage, the passage was, in today's context, we can construe it to be something like China or America. So they are bartering innovations. Whoever is bartering innovations with you, what are you going to give them? So you give them a foothold. You give them a little bit of what you possess, which you think is an abundance or something that does not have hold any value for you. Nonetheless, the other people, the people who are holding all the cards in this context of the three paras, it's civilization, right? So what it's effectively doing is it's educating you, it's teaching you to be itself for its own purposes. And you single-mindedly are looking at your own progress, forgetting that all of this which you can't see, things like we can't see, let us say 30 years ago, if we knew China is going to behave this way, how the entire world would be varied. Back then, when China started booming with its manufacturing, people loved China. China was the greatest. China was giving us goods for cheap and good goods. No one cared about USA. Almost single-handedly, they brought down the entire industry of the states. Like all the markets were now Chinese. Now USA also interpreted that, and then USA moved to another phase. Now USA is not just into core manufacturing; it's into innovation, and it's about leading. And Europe always maintained its little hold on quality and on quality protocols, if you understand it. Even today, most of the banking systems of the world come like they're headquartered in London. the city of London per se. They have their own rules and dynamics. So you see, now we would think, what's wrong with that, right? They're just running some rules, right? London. Those rules run your life and mine. Those are the financial rules on which the largest banks in the world operate. That gives them power. They change one thing there. We don't even realize it. 10 years down the line, it's going to affect our entire nation. China is doing that. USA is doing that. But to be fair, as we are learning, the one thing the book, if we would go further and understand how Apna Altai started to understand civilization and defeat them, is they're also learning from them, like we are. We are now at the precipice of using whatever we have learned from these people to apply it back to them. Now we will become manufacturing hubs. We will become the places of power, because see, more than manufacturing hubs, we are like the, what do you say, like the golden hen for like markets. 1 billion strong, with money to spend. This is where your goods will end up, wherever the hell they're made. Now we have that leverage too, and we can make our goods. This is something you can expound better because of your background in economics. But as a layman as well, I will consider myself that. This is what comes to my mind. And then at the end of the day, now I'll tell you the trip, right? Doesn't matter. I mean, Chinese are just trying to live, Indians are trying to live, Americans are trying to live. So if you can look at this game without rancor, without hatred, without having anti-nationalism. I mean, like, what is with like, the funniest thing I find is the border, all borders, right? I mean, we invest so much in that border. That is real. Can you imagine a world if you're not afraid? You don't think of that border as a border? Why can't the influence of your nation go beyond it? It's a border, cool, whatever. But it's a game at the end of the day. And we can't invest everything in the game. Perspective still is change. Codify that change to make a God last us from one generation to the other. And that, I think, would be how I would link those 3 chapters to what's going on today. The only problem is, once we stop investing our hearts in it, once we stop that, we see it for what it is, then we become powerful, we become wise, we become intelligent. I mean, you just got to let go of holding on. You got to see it for the flow that it is. And whoever you are in life, whatever your vocation or passion, you're going to do well. Every person in their field who is worth something I have met, they don't take it personally. It's not supposed to be taken personally. Because at the end of the day, I'm angry with China, right? You're angry with China. Bro, that individual in the village is just trying to live. He's got kids the same as us. He's got a family the same as us. If we can find a way which all of us can survive and feed our children, can educate them, and then like, live a happy life till we die, taken care of in our old age, why will we not like that system? The trip, as expounded in the book as well, is to find that system and not to hate those who are even going against it. There is no evil. They're not at the behest of a warlord. They're not at the behest of the devil. Just trying to live. Sometimes they just don't know how. But they're educating. They will. Well, then the fight's fun. I mean, without it, it's boring, right? Real torture in life.
Yeah, but I mean, to expand upon that, now at the level of the individual, of course, man, we're just trying to live, and that's that. But at the collective level, for example, since you mentioned China, it's important to see how China views itself also. China views itself as the middle kingdom, right? So that has its own implications, on our relationship with them, on their relationship with the world, really. And since you mentioned the border, one needs a landmass in order to enforce ideas that one thinks are the right ideas, right? So how do you view that? Because there are different worldviews, and if we are not invested in those borders, our worldview might not exist if we don't have that landmass.
I agree. So I personally don't think people in places of power and position, like Modi, like Jinping, like Putin, even Trump for that matter, they don't view it the same way we view the border as a border. For them, it is a very practical, objective view. The border is there, yes, but the investment is what is happening at the border. Border, for us, it becomes real, as you're saying, to safeguard our ideology and our thought, which is correct, absolutely at our level. At the level of these individuals who are actually in charge of what goes on at the border, for them, it is communication. You know how the beast, which is India, if we can coalesce it into one entity with 1.3 billion souls, and we can coalesce China as an entity with 1.3 billion souls, the communication between these entities is what happened at the border. It's not war from our perspective. It's not Chinese aggression. It's not Indian insubordination as they will be looking at it. No, it is communication. if we were to sit down on tea and have that, imagine a very Victorian setting. It could be something like China is saying very easily, it's trying to understand that the entire world is right now hating on it, the virus, and for the fact that it's a very secretive nation who does not openly in this global age share information with us. So now what is China to do? Now it's got such a bad rap, and for all the bantering of the politicians, let's keep it aside. This virus was made in a lab. This virus was released in China. Now we're not saying it's they meant to do it. It just happens when you play with such important things, etc. The world is knowing this. The world is angry with China. China has one thing to do, right? How does it preserve its integrity? This is China telling us when we are sitting across India, which is a powerful neighbor, something it's afraid of, with America, which is another, on T, communication between what's happening on the border, what's happening in the South China Sea. It's saying, look, guys, it's not my fault. Yeah, it happened. I'm sorry. I'm trying to safeguard my stuff. And it just happened. So like, we got to roll with it. Now, I know you're going to try and make me take the blame, bro. But I'll tell you what, that one bad thing I've done, good enough. 10 good things I'm doing that you guys are making money of, that's also something which I'm doing. So please don't forget that. And if you want mass produce cheap goods, bro, I'm sorry, you need a combination. I am that combination. I'm the only goddamn combination that's working. You want cheapness? Why isn't America giving me cheapness? This is the conversation happening by banging at our border. It's telling us that. When we bang back, we are telling them that all is good enough. But how you are going about it, we don't like it. And although we are democratic, we are very socialistically inclined to be democratic. And I believe, China, your time is sort of coming to a little rest. You are getting a little old. You should rest. You should leave these things to us, India. We're not going to back down that easily. Yeah? And there's so much of a market that if we take a little bit of your share, you shouldn't feel so scared either. That way, when we reduce your workload, you can look towards your biological agents. You can look towards safeguarding what you should. What's your problem? Now, this lovely Victorian conversation between these two greats, India and China, occurs in the way it occurs at the basic level through are pushing each other at the border, through the loss of a few lives, through them posturing in the South China Sea, through them for no rhyme or reason picking on Japan from time to time. Japan having to say, bad. But all of this comes to discussion. Now, people, we understand that in whichever field we are, we treat it as such. The end result is exactly what our nation needs. And at the end of the day, even if we consider India to be a nation, we are 1,000 nations. We have Uttar Pradesh, which is itself thousands of nations, right? We have Maharashtra, we have this, we have that. Similarly, China has its own Fujian and whatever, Hunan and whatever, its provinces. But if we then look outwards, are we not all provinces of Earth with just a limited amount of resources? To make the best out of it. The sadness is where now this is the flight of fancy, which like as a writer I want to take, like I keep wishing one global calamity, like not engineered by us, an alien invasion perhaps the threat of the sun dying, something. So we understand we are one and then we band together, which is happening through the UN. Like the last time we slapped the shit out of each other proper, like was World War II, right? Properly. Then we're like, no, we can't do this. Let's just sit together. Now we keep giving UN a little more power, little more productivity, which will be guaranteed after everyone's got an education, everyone can feed their kids, feed themselves, and look after their health. And slowly, these borders, as we say, will be the same border you and I face, Keshav, when we're leaving Madhya Pradesh and entering UP. That too is a border. But that is the kind of charming border we should have. I mean, I get angry thinking, why is China belonging to the Chinese? Is it not racism? They got slant eyes, I don't. They have a different skin color than me. That means that's theirs? No. I grew up in Chinese history too. I love the Ming Empire. I based so much of my ideas about the Shang dynasty. China's taught me so much. I mean, if I go talk to the average Chinese in the village, he'll look at me like I'm talking another language. How much of history have you imbibed yourself, Keshav? And now, just because we look like this, we're not part of that history. Dude, I pray to Tengri because I love the power that God, sky god of Genghis Khan gave him. I go to Mongolia and tomorrow they're going to say, I'm not Mongol. Why is that? Have I not learned from your Genghis Khan? Have I not understood his grandness? So, borders exist, yes, but they should be with that intellectual appeal where, yes, you have your point of view, I have mine. Sometimes we borrow each other's points of view. It can't be mine, yours, because then I'm trying to preserve what's mine and you are trying to preserve what's yours. And you know, Ibn Battuta, the traveler who came to India, he came to India 200 to 300 years after the Islamic invasion of India. And he went to Varanasi. And there he wanted to talk to the Pandits at the Ghats to understand ancient Hindu culture and science. He couldn't, of course, he's a Muslim. He's at that time he's a Muslim, right? Not even today. Like, oh my God, I can't touch you. My caste gonna go this, that, death, rebirth, all of that jazz. So no one gave him any knowledge. Ibn Battuta was asked later. He went to some other area, I think Patliputra or whatever. Why do you think India lost? Because he was so happy with like this is such a beautiful cultural zone, this that, and he's like, I think India lost because they didn't share their knowledge. He said this is the same that will happen to all cultures. Eventually, the Islamic culture of India also had to keep its knowledge to itself. Now, knowledge here can mean a lot of things. Knowledge is the individuals who I hold dear to me, right? Who are in positions of power. They are people only I know. It's not about merit anymore. Because I have that fear of losing that knowledge. Through knowledge, the Brahmins thought they'll lose their standing. These Muslim invaders, they thought if they dilute the Muslim team at the top, they will lose their strength. They lost it eventually. In fact, the only time Islamic rule in India was actually totally accepted, and in fact, it was flowering, was during Akbar, who did not believe in any of these religious divisions to the level that they did later on. He was not an insecure person. He understood who he was, a devout Muslim. He understood the devout Hindu. He liked Moholi, and he would not mind his subjects praying for him, whichever God they prayed for his well-being. What's the problem with that? He flowered. So if we can just do that with the earth, yes, you have your view, I have my view. We can't fight over it. Between our views, we have to find why there is a difference and reach a consensus. I want to go to China, man. I want to see China. It's got so much beauty. And I'm sure there's so many Chinese who want to see India. We want to go to Mansarovar one time, look at where our God is supposed to just sit there. We know their stories, but they fill us with happiness. China being China, India being India. I mean, pipe dreams for now, but you and I are still growing up, Keshav. One day, huh?
So how do you view this whole religious angle, man, in India? Because again, when we talk of borders, we've been split into 3 countries since 1947. And personally for me, I look at all these states, right? China, India, and so on, especially the ancient world, as civilizational states, not as constitutional states, you know. So for me, India is not just a state that was formed in 1947 based on a book. It's a larger civilization that expands way beyond the territory of present day India, you know. So how do you look at this religious narrative in India and how it's shaped our modern history?
Now, this is one of the wala question, because if I have to look at the religious history of India, and this I am not including you in this discussion, I'm including individuals for whom this is very real. For us, this is inspirational. It is not real. For a lot of people, this is real. So for them, I'm not overstating or understating it. It is Manchester United versus Manchester City. It is just that. You and I are about football. They will be about Man U versus Man City. All the players of Man U and Man City are not about Man U and Man City. They again are about football. So the difference is, for them, religion is the same narrative as Bollywood is. It's something that is giving them a space to tell themselves together. Something they can bind themselves to. A point of view. It could be anything. It could be, worshipping just nothing. Even atheists, according to me, are a religion. Their God is anti-God. That's the name of their God in my head. And they all have this same set of rules which they go by which they give themselves power, by which they give science and physics power, right? But at the end of the day, they're all just tying themselves together to something. Now, only problem is, as with law, I came across this, I think it's one of the founding fathers of America or something, an American for sure. The saying I remember though was, law does not, we do not exist to serve law. Law exists to serve us. And in the same way, we have forgotten to look at religion in that way. And now the problem, as it's compounded, you asked about India, right? Now in India, religion and statehood, religion was the basic layer from which our sciences evolved, the ancient days, our poetry evolved, our sensibilities, and even the later Indic religions evolved from very poor basic idea of what religion is. It is easy today to say that Jainism came from Hinduism. In my world, it is like saying that we came from apes, humans. No, we didn't. We apes and humans had a common ancestor from which we both are derived. So it is easy to see Hinduism in the way of continuity, that yes, there was a Hinduism that existed before Jainism. That Hinduism and today's Hinduism are not at all, you can't recognize them. That was a proto-state, proto-Indic, proto-Vedic state, from which these other religions branched out. So our basis was, let us say, the definition of karma, the definition of dharma. What is the cyclicity of life and death? The expounding of these gave rise to our way of dialogue, our religion, and even our politics. Like Arthashastra was written by Kautilya, right? Who was at the end of the day a Brahmin who must have gone through that entire Brahminical study structure at the time, and then he came up with something which was practical. Now, as Indians, I would say, and to be very fair, before the Islamicization of Pakistan and Bangladesh, even Pakistan and Bangladesh, their views about these are very, you cannot compare the Middle East with the way even the Indian subcontinent Muslims view Islam. For us, we understand, let us say, the beauty of a metaphor. We understand metaphor to be separate from the subject matter. Middle East, unfortunately, cannot do that. And we cannot even blame them for it, because as ancient as our structure is, Middle East was the first place where farming was initiated. The first city-states came up there. So they had they were a contract. Semitic religions were a contract with God. A contract by which I behave this way, you give me this. Indic religions, Eastern religions, Chinese religions, they had a flow to things. So we imbibe that flow. Now the problem becomes, in today's context, when you see Indian who's out of India, the Muslim, the Hindu, the Sikh, the Jain, they're all Indian. Out there, we can defend our virtues. Out there, we can defend our value systems. In fact, I know of Muslims who don't touch like books with their feet. The book is falling, he's going to do his own whatever thing and lift it up. Now you ask, now the more pious Muslim will say, this is a way of worship. This is therefore shirk, and you cannot do shirk in Islam. The Indian Muslim is like, no, man, I'm just giving goddamn respect to a goddamn book. It's a book. And the metaphor he understands, which he can't even elaborate upon, is it used to be Saraswati. Used to be a goddess. Now for you and me also, you do have the statue of Saraswati in your house and you pray to her. It is a metaphor. It is an ideal for you. Channelize what is within you, not outside you. And you can use it like that. But wo ghar ki jab baat ho jati hai, then it becomes different. Then the Indian Muslims also got his own like, hey, no. And then we have yes. At the end of the day, they won't shut up about it as long as we keep pointing at them, both sides. We let them do their thing. We progress. We tell them why we are progressing. Your way is asinine. It will give you what? 2 generations worth of happiness, then it won't. And look at the youth of today. Youth which is beyond us also. I mean, we are also a little old here. Everyone, religion for them is a facet. It's not everything. It's cool, religion is cool. It gives them a background, gives them a morality and ethics, but then they imbibe everything else. The last thing I will say about this issue is that the most knowledgeable individual about the Mahabharata I have met, who knew the story of even this guy, Shakuni Mama's marriage, Shakuni's father's father and all that, was a strict Puri individual called Hussain Dudwala. That boy used to watch Mahabharata like how our grannies want. And he imbibed it culturally. It's cool. Now we are facing a little bit of a tremor. But at the end of the day, it's all going to go away because Indians realize this is their culture. You cannot escape your culture. And like wise always in India, we will welcome as many gods as they are. You and me, Keshav, don't we celebrate Christmas? We do. We celebrate all Hindu festivals. I go to the Gurdwara as well. And then for Muharram, nothing better than eating that goddamn apna, what I accidentally called prasad. My friend Farzan, he took me to the mosque. And then I'm standing there and I look a little Irani and everyone's quiet, right? Then all of a sudden I got hungry. So I'm like, hey, prasad kam milega. And I look at him. And you should see those 3 people just look at me like that. And then Farzan's like, mil raha karke. But then even they, like, can you imagine me doing this in the Middle East? I'd be on a goddamn video there. Out here, they just looked at me. Oh, okay. Then that's it. And they gave me a lot of prasad. That khatti bread there. Mad. So this, it could be a pipe dream too.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a complex thing as artists, you know, as artists, we can we can propound upon it, and it's a very fascinating subject to get into also. But moving on, before we wrap this up, man, I'd like you to tell us a little bit about what the next steps are, because this is the first book in a series of many. And also, just to let people know, this is it's quite an epic book. It's got a map of the world that Swayam has created on the first page. It's got languages that he's created. It's got a host of stuff, man. So what's your plan for the rest of the books, and how are you going to go about that?
So this is the first book where I try and understand our interconnection through sociological and economic factors, right? Like how kingdoms are created, how this. Beyond this, my next book, I will tackle how biology also influences us. Like we keep being told, right? Hating is wrong and anger is incorrect and certain actions are taboo, certain aren't. But at the end of the day, these actions are also ours, right? We do hate, do have anger, we do get aggressive. This has a biological basis which has helped us survive and made us the apex creature on this planet. And in this biosphere, we rule supreme. We cannot discount them. And I wish to understand why we cannot discount them. So I cannot say where is the good in the bad, which will sound good, but I would like to say where is the truth in it. So like the first book takes us through 70 years, right? The second book is going to take us through 2 million years. The length of a biological evolution, how that is influencing us, how, let us say, a repetition of an idea in our mind has influenced our bodies, which it does in real time. How do you think evolution happens? That fish doesn't just jump out of the water and become a land thing, right? It takes years. It takes an environment where it's half water, it's half land. It takes a struggle for this creature, a fight. It tries to better its little space, find more resources, go for it to whichever like avenues are available, then become something. So the second, now it's sounding drab, but it's not, because all of this is going to be told from the background of a story of an individual. And the second book, the first book, I will be rather admitting it's on a serious note. And for somehow the second book, it's a laugh, it's a ride. It's about creatures that live for thousands of years and how they lose all relevance. And the only flight of fantasy in the second book is you are immortal. Chalo. Let's see what happens if you're immortal. But they're the craziest people because language is forgotten after 1,000 years. They can't communicate with someone. They're very powerful, but you don't know what they want. Then what use is them going crazy? They go crazy for thousands of years. But again, because they're crazy for thousands of years, Keshav, they get sane again. They're like, okay, yeah, now it's like, what? Like the brain's rerouting itself, I'm here. And they find themselves, that realm I've created, the most poignant and the most useless of creatures are the immortals with immense power. No one can understand that power. Now imagine like volcanoes, right? Are you afraid of a volcano? No, it's a natural thing. These creatures who become so powerful are akin to natural calamities. They have no power. Because humans found a way to take the most powerful of things and convert it for their rights and their ends. Some ancient is mad, he's tearing up a town. People leave a wide swath for him, let him get his anger out. Those few who have died have been gone to their version of heaven or hell in that book which I've created, and the rest are there and they will learn some lessons from this great and awesome God of theirs, and he's going mad. Like, I just want to kill, I want you to shut up. You can't take mortals away from their greatness no matter what. That sort of thing. And then there is another book. There are going to be 6 books in a series, and the entirety of it will take place over 13 billion years. And I want to explain, like, that's half-life of a proton, how we are going to take us through everything, and then finally end at a good place, I think. But it may just not be so. Mood swings.
It sounds really good, man. I'm looking forward to the second book personally. I'm looking forward to all of the books. And I hope more and more people pick up The God Killer, man, and read it. It's a really, really good book. And I'm not just saying that because my friend wrote it, but I really believe that it's a very good book. So yeah, please go and get your hands on it. And so I'm wonderful talking to you, man. Thanks a lot for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. I don't know why I did this. It's cool.
But thanks a lot, man. And we'll meet soon.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.